At his speech Wednesday, the president called for quick action by Congress to reduce what he called the crushing tax burden on companies and workers.
So this is our once-in-a-generation opportunity to deliver real tax reform for everyday, hardworking Americans. And I am fully committed to working with Congress to get this job done. And I don't want to be disappointed by Congress. Do you understand me? Do you understand? Understand. Congress. I think Congress is going to make a comeback. I hope so. Tell you what, the United States is counting on it.
CBS News Chief Congressional Correspondent Nancy Cordes is in our Washington bureau. So, Nancy, the president has been pushing for a tax overhaul for some time. The White House handed out a one-page proposal back in April. Since then, have we really gotten any new details on what the plan will entail?
Well, we've gotten some guidance, Elaine, from congressional Republicans who are really the ones who are working out the nitty-gritty here and actually coming up with the contours of this tax reform package. We know, for instance, that they, like the White House, want to shrink the number of tax brackets from 7, which it is right now, down to 3, but we don't know what the tax rates for those brackets would be yet. We also know that they, like the White House, want to slash the corporate tax rate. President Trump has put forward a 15% figure. He'd like to cut it from 35% down to 15%. Congressional Republicans tend to think that that is a little bit unrealistic. They have talked more about a 20% rate, which would still be a very significant drop from where it is right now. And they've also said, Elaine, that they want to enshrine some aspects of the tax code. So they want to make sure that they are still encouraging and incentivizing saving for retirement, for example, and home ownership and charitable giving. But they've also signaled that perhaps they might try to incentivize those things differently than the way the tax code does right now, perhaps changing those deductions in some way. And that's obviously going to be of critical importance to millions of taxpayers who are going to want to know what the fine print says.
Absolutely. Well, Nancy, the president said he wants to work with Democrats. Senator Chuck Schumer laid out what Democrats want. No increased burden on the middle class, for legislation to go through regular order, and not adding to the deficit. So how likely are those guidelines to be met? And are there places where each side can find common ground?
Well, Republicans have already said, Elaine, that they hope Democrats come on board, but they're not going to attempt to negotiate or compromise with them. They are going to go the route of reconciliation, which sounds familiar because it's the same approach they took with their health care reform plan, which, as we know, failed. The advantage of going in that direction is that you only need 50 votes in the Senate instead of 60. That means they don't need any Democratic votes to pass it. On the other hand, it means that they can afford to lose almost no Republicans. Now, what Republicans argue is that it's not that they didn't learn from their failure in health care, but that they believe that Republicans are more united on tax reform than they were on health care reform. And so they say, sure, they think that they'd love to have Democrats come on board. They think there will be a lot about their package for Democrats to like, but they aren't going to be doing much, Elaine, to try to bring them on board. And already Senate Democrats have written a letter saying that they're not going to support any tax reform package, for example, that gives a tax break to the top 1%. But it seems pretty clear right now that the tax plan, at least that the White House has floated, would drastically reduce the top tax rate. And unless you really dramatically eliminate all kinds of loopholes and deductions for the wealthy, it seems pretty clear that they would be getting a tax cut under this plan.
So meantime, President Trump called out Democratic Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill, saying she needed to pass reform or be voted out of office. She's up for re-election in 2018. Do you think that kind of warning is going to have an impact on her decision?
It certainly puts her in the spotlight, and she is going to have to tread very carefully, as she would have had to do anyway, because Missouri did go pretty significantly for Donald Trump in the presidential election. So she's already got a tough race. She has won tough races before, but he is going to do what any strategic president would do when he's in her home state, is he's going to take a jab at her. And so there will be pressure from many in her home state for her to really take this Republican proposal seriously. And, you know, she certainly will feel pressure to get on board. Whether she will or not, I think really depends on what we see from Republicans when they finally do make their plan public. Democrats have argued pretty strenuously, and she's right there in that camp, that they're not going to support any kind of tax reform package that increases the deficit. And they argue right now that if you try to slash the corporate tax rate from 35% down to 20%, if you give everyone across the board a huge tax cut, both the wealthy and the middle class, they argue it's very hard to see how you could do that without increasing the deficit.
As you know, the president has struggled to move forward with his agenda. How likely, Nancy, do you think is tax reform to happen this year when you have things like the debt ceiling and Hurricane Harvey relief that are absolutely pressing at this moment?
Right. Well, the time frame has already slipped. Initially, they said they wanted to get tax reform done this summer. That was always pretty unrealistic. Now they're moving into the fall. But as you point out, Elaine, they've already got so much on their plate that they have to do, even before they get to the things that they want to do. They have to raise the government's borrowing limit by the end of September. They have to fund the government by the end of the summer, by the end of September, rather. They know that Texas needs a lot of help, and that they're going to have to pass some kind of at least short-term relief package, possibly even in the tens of billions of dollars, and then they'll have to go back and look at long-term funding for rebuilding after that. And then you've got a threat from the President of the United States that he might try to prompt a government shutdown if government funding doesn't include funding for a border wall. And so when they get back from recess next week, there is a ton on their plates before they even start to talk about tax reform. And this is really one of those issues, Elaine, that Republicans and Democrats alike have been saying for years that is at the top of their agenda. Both parties agree that the 2,600-page tax code is bloated, it's outdated, it's incredibly confusing. It hasn't really gotten a serious overhaul in decades, but it is simply one of those issues that has always proved almost impossible for them to tackle, because there's so little trust between the two parties right now, because it's so complicated, because there are so many special interest groups who are all trying to protect this loophole or that deduction. And so, you know, even people with the best of intentions would have a very, very difficult time actually being successful on tax reform. But it is the top Republican priority, and the White House and Republican leaders are aligned on this. So they're going to give it everything they've got.
All right. Nancy Cordes in Washington for us. Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.